The concepts of role-based access control. Managing access to resources in Azure is a critical part of an organization's security and compliance requirements. Role-based access controls is the capability for you to grant appropriate access to Azure AD users, groups, and services. Role-based access controls is configured by selecting a role and then associating the role with a user, group, or a service principal. A role is nothing but the definition of what actions are allowed and what actions are denied. Finally, this combination of role and users groups is scoped to either a subscription, a resource group, or a specific resources within a resource group. A role is a collection of actions that can be performed on Azure resources. A user or a service can perform an action on an Azure resource, provided they have the role assigned to them. There are many built-in roles. There are certain common inbuilt roles. We call them as owner, contributor, and reader. So owner can manage everything including access. A contributor can manage everything except access. A reader will have just read-only access, can just view everything, but they cannot make any changes. Let's go into the Azure portal and see where we can assign permissions to the resources. So everything that you see inside the Azure portal is nothing but an Azure resource. So let's say I go and click on a storage account, and this is a resource. I already have a storage account, and now I want to grant permissions to, let's say, a new user. And because the user is new, I want to grant him just read only permissions or maybe the reader role. So you can use the Azure portal to make your role assignments. In this example, I'm using the storage account and then navigating to the IAM section where we can manage the current role and scopes. You can add and remove the roles as you need. You can add the synced users from on-premise Active Directory and the synced groups as well. And this is what enables organizations to centrally grant access to the resources. I can just click on add and then add role assignment, and all the roles that I was referring to is all defined right here. You want to grant somebody a monitoring reader access, log analytic access, or log analytics contributor. Well, you can go ahead and look at all of these options we have. Then if there is any confusion, then just hover your mouse over this information icon and it tells you what that is. Users and groups are sourced from Azure Active Directory. So once I've selected a role, I can then select a user from this list. Well, if you don't find the user in this list, just start typing in the username and it automatically pops up, only if it is available. Okay, so I'll type a user called as Andre, and I want to grant access to Andre on my subscription, specifically on my storage account, and he or she will then have the reader access. Let's click on save. So when Andre now logs into the Azure portal, they will then be able to read what's there inside the storage account. Now these users that you saw in this list, they can be either on-premise Active Directory users or can be the users that are created in Azure AD directly. Let's talk about more powerful permissions in the next lesson, specifically global administrator role. From the previous module, you understand that Azure AD can be used to designate separate administrators to serve different functions. Administrators can be designated in the Azure AD portal to perform tasks such as adding users, changing, assigning admin roles, resetting user passwords, managing user licenses, and several other activities like that. One of the most powerful role in Azure AD is Global Administrator. A global administrator has all the administrative access in Azure Active Directory. By default, the person who signs up for an Azure subscription is assigned the global admin role for the directory. Only global administrators can assign other admin roles. For now, I will navigate to the Azure Active Directory section and show you where roles are configured. Now, once you launch Azure Active Directory from the Azure portal, Scroll down to the point where you see roles and administrators. Now here are all the roles that we have in Azure Active Directory. One such role is the Global Administrator. Now if you look at this role and read the description, it says that it can manage all the aspects of Azure AD and Microsoft services that use Azure AD identities. And that means that any user that is assigned to this role will then become a global administrator and hence becoming the most powerful entity that can manage the users, groups, and anything related to identities in Azure Cloud. Going back to the roles and administrators section and resetting this to default, just wanted to take a look at all the roles that we have here. Now, if you are very curious about a particular role, let's say Azure DevOps Administrator, and you want to know what it does, all you got to do is click on description. And then you will see very granular details about what that role can do. So let's take a look at few of these options. Now, just by looking at it, looks like any user who is assigned to this role can read the contacts of the property of Azure Active Directory. I would like you to read some of these descriptions to understand more about a role in this section. Going back to roles and administrators again, you can observe and manage all the members of the administrative roles in Azure Active Directory portal from this console. When you are viewing a roles member, you can observe the complete list of permissions granted by that role assignment. Now, this list that you see under the description is nothing but complete list of permissions that will be assigned to a user when you link this role to that user or a group. I also want to stress on a point that access does not need to be granted to an entire subscription. There are roles out here that can be assigned for resource groups as well as for individual resources. In Azure Role-Based Access Control, a resource inherits role assignments from its parent resources. What does that mean? It means that if you assign a permission at a resource group level or even at a subscription level, it will be inheriting down from the resource group to the resources underneath it. We know that from the previous section that management groups are the topmost entity in the hierarchy. So if you assign permissions at the management group level, the permissions will then flow down from the management group to the subscription and from the subscription to the resource group and from that resource group to the bottom into the resources level. So a resource will always inherit role assignments from its parent resources. So if a user, group, or a service is granted access to only a resource group within a subscription, they will be able to access only that resource group and the resources within it, and not other resource groups within the subscription. Let's understand more about how role definitions are created. What runs in the background? Is it JSON or an XML? How does that work? Let's take a look at that in the next lesson. Now that we know that there are lots of roles and administrators inside the Azure Active Directory, let's dive a little bit more in detail to understand them better. Every role is a set of properties. So if you click on a particular role, you will be able to see what that role can do much more in detail by inspecting these permissions. So when a user is assigned a particular role, like application developer, he or she would then get the following permissions. Now in the background, these are defined in the form of a JSON file. The role definition includes several things like name, ID, whether it is true or false, description, actions, which includes what the role can do, and not actions is what the role cannot do, and where is the scope of that particular role. Let's understand more in detail about these particular things. These are nothing but role definitions. So in this lesson, let's understand about the role definitions, specifically about each one of these items. Let's talk about the name attribute. A name is nothing but the name of the role. In this case, it is the owner. The ID is a specific GUID or a unique identifier assigned to the role. Is custom, whether it is customized, yes or no. Anything that comes inbuilt in Azure Active Directory is not customized, and that's why you see the owner attribute as false. But as you know that you can go back to Azure Active Directory and create your own custom roles. But make sure that you are at least at P1 or P2 to create your role. The description is something good for us to understand what that role does. And then there is an action and not actions field. The actions and not action properties can be tailored to grant and deny the exact permissions you need. What kind of permissions do you want to grant to that particular role? So if you navigate to the developer and then look at these description objects, looks like application developer has the permission of create as owner. Now this is something that it can do. But all of these are allowed attributes. You can also define what is not allowed. For example, the contributor role cannot delete, cannot write, cannot elevate, or even cannot do any actions specific to that subscription. Whereas the owner role has full permissions on the subscription, hence nothing will be defined under not actions. And then there is another thing called as assignable scopes. That is nothing but the scope of your role. Defining the actions and not action properties is not enough to fully implement a role. You must also properly scope your role. The assignable scopes property of the role specifies the scope, like where the role can do certain actions like subscriptions, resource groups, or even resources. So when you are creating a custom role, this assignment of the scope of your role is very important. You can make the custom role available for assignment in only subscriptions or resource groups that require it. The resources in Azure, resource groups, subscriptions, management groups, and the entire tenant collectively makes up your resource hierarchy. Settings at the root management group, such as Azure custom roles or Azure policy assignments, can impact every resource in your resource hierarchy. If your organization has multiple subscriptions, then the best way to efficiently manage access, policies, and compliance for those subscriptions is via management groups. One thing to bear in mind is the fact that the permissions granted at the top level will always inherit to the resource underneath it. That means that if you grant excessive permissions at the top level, be watchful because they will have the same rights at all levels in that hierarchy. So granting permissions, although is very easy in Azure, but then you got to see the long-term effect of granting permissions at the top level. Let's try to understand this better with PowerShell. So I'm going to launch the PowerShell from the console itself and then resize this to get a better view. Alright, so I got authenticated and my Azure drive is built, but what I want to show you is the command which is responsible to retrieve the Azure role definitions. The command to retrieve the roles and the definitions is get-az role definition. So when you hit enter, you're going to get a set of roles and their JSON equivalent. That's what we were talking about in the previous lesson, that every role is nothing but a JSON file. And you are clearly able to see the JSON file right here in this section. And we're talking about different attributes of a role like name, ID, whether it is custom or not, the description of it, and actions, what is it allowed to do and what it is not allowed to do, and then the scope of the object. This is something you can clearly see from the PowerShell commandlet, which is get-az role definition. Of course, you can use your PowerShell skills now to filter this further. So I'm going to pipe it and say, hey, I just want to see the name and then the description of the Azure role. So when you hit enter, it's going to pull up all the roles that I have and their respective descriptions. You can always filter it further and then say, hey, I don't want to see the name and description, but show me just the actions. And probably you also want to take a look at not actions. And when you hit enter, it's going to just show what kind of activities are possible using various roles that we have in our subscription. Okay, with this, we are not only able to see the power of Azure roles and how deeply it is integrated into Azure, but also the power of PowerShell that you can derive the values right from the command line interface available here. All right, so in the next section, let's go ahead and take a look at the different kinds of user accounts and groups that can be created in Azure Active Directory. The resources in Azure, resource groups, subscriptions, management groups, and the entire tenant collectively makes up your resource hierarchy. Settings at the root management group, such as Azure custom roles or Azure policy assignments, can impact every resource in your resource hierarchy. If your organization has multiple subscriptions, then the best way to efficiently manage access, policies, and compliance for those subscriptions is via management groups. One thing to bear in mind is the fact that the permissions granted at the top level will always inherit to the resource underneath it. That means that if you grant excessive permissions at the top level, be watchful because they will have the same rights at all levels in that hierarchy. So granting permissions, although is very easy in Azure, but then you got to see the long-term effect of granting permissions at the top level.